especially as a C-suite leader and even as a VP, it's not just the knowledge and the skills and experience that you directly possess that you can bring to a role. It's the knowledge, skills, and experience you have access to. And even at that level, when you talk about how to navigate the hard things, all of them speak to being able to lean on their peer networks to be able to help them. Because again, like nobody has seen and done everything. And so you've got to be really intentional about building those networks on your way up, not just when you arrive at that C-suite. And I think in doing so, you'll be able to, harness that collective intellect of your network equity to bring to kind of solve problems, including things you haven't seen before.
Hey there. Welcome to the Life and Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, Tegan Travato, founder and CEO of Bright Arrow Coaching. In this show, we dive deep into how leaders like you can turn business challenges into personal growth opportunities. Whether you're a seasoned executive or an aspiring leader, this podcast is your go-to resource for unlocking your full potential in both your professional and personal life. Join me as we hear from executives, experts, and innovators about their leadership journeys and learn how to develop better strategies and activate them for success. So if you're ready to fuel your journey to becoming an extraordinary leader who makes a lasting impact, you're in the right place. Let's dive in. Moving into a role in the C-suite isn't just about climbing the corporate ladder. It's about a complete shift in how you think, lead, and influence. It's a transition that requires not only a deep understanding of your own function, but also a broader perspective on how to create value across the entire organization. In this episode, we're talking about what it really takes to make that leap. This discussion is adapted from a recent Bright Arrow webinar, Charting Your Course from VP to the C-Suite, where I had the pleasure of chatting alongside two other remarkable leaders, Lars Schmidt, founder and CEO of Amplify Talent, and Suzanne Coonan, the head of Global Employee Learning and Executive Development for a Fortune 500 tech company. In our conversation, we really get into the nuances of transitioning to the C-suite mindset, like shifting from the focus on your own department to thinking about the entire company. We also explore the importance of building solid relationships, staying curious, and being real about what you know and what you don't know. Plus, we share some practical advice and stories about the challenges and rewards of moving to the C-suite. If you're aiming for that next big step in your career, or just curious about what it takes to lead at the highest level of an organization, you'll find plenty of useful information to help you on your journey. We first jump right into the topic that I think is so important. What is the difference? The real difference between being a VP and stepping into the C-suite. In this conversation, I had some thoughts on this because it's such a nuanced shift. And it's not just about the title. It's about how you approach leadership, strategy, and the bigger picture. It takes so very much, but I think some of the things I always start with is the ability to think more interdepartmentally and for the enterprise. So VPs, naturally, are still thinking for their function and usually their closest sphere of influence. So maybe just one or two other departments that they may work with to deliver work product or services. I think the hallmark of moving closer to C-suite readiness is that you understand more broadly how to create value across the enterprise and not just for your functional area. So I think that's one. I think another is that VPs are ready to move into the C-suite when they are a leader among leaders and they're a people developer. So their ability to develop talent and get work done through that talent shows a readiness to lead at another level. And now here's what Suzanne and Lars had to say.
What I've seen a lot is the willingness to go outside of your functional org in service of the full company or enterprise. And so that means kind of advocating for what's best for the company, what's best for the future, taking some big risks and being willing to collaborate and help others be successful, helping your peers be successful, which is not always easy to do.
The only thing that I would maybe add in terms of the nuance between VP and C-suite is, and I agree with all the points made in terms of like understanding areas outside of your own functional area. Maybe the additional add-on I would put on that is having a level of business acumen beyond just like understanding kind of how your domain fits to serve the goals of the business. Other domains fit to serve the goals of the business, but being able to really understand the landscape of the industry, that to me is probably one of the things that maybe you don't always see in a VP role, but you absolutely need in a C-suite position. So yeah, that would be the only thing I would add.
We're in the midst of a technology revolution right now. So we need the leaders to pop their heads out of the day-to-day and the short-term focus of this quarter or year end and say, where are we going to be 1, 2, 3 years down the road? And what do we need to do to get there? So massive transformation is underway and it's difficult to do. You have to both transform and perform at the same time and not always easy.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think that there's two big differentiators, particularly for executive leadership, but really I think this kind of cascades down to any leaders that I think are ingredients for success. Like one is learning agility, and the other is network equity. And I'll expand a bit on each. So I think learning agility, particularly if you're transitioning from we all talked about like, yes, you need to know your domain, you need to know your peers' domains, you need to know the business domain and the industry, and you need to have that grasp of that. Yes, you need all those things, but that's not enough. Like you also need to be curious and have external inputs around like the things that are happening around the world that may impact and influence those things. And obviously, we're going through this patch of volatility as humans, right, that we've seen over the last 4 years and is continuing that, all of these things impact strategy, they impact tactics, they impact the positioning of the business within the industry, new threats that are emerging. AI, it's a whole other thing that you have to really understand and have, curiosity around. So that piece is key. And then the other is really, when I say network equity, it's not networking. It's not having like peers that you can connect to, although it's also that. It's the ability to really intentionally and consciously build a robust network of leaders both in your domain and outside of it. Because especially as a C-suite leader, and even as a VP, it's not just the knowledge and the skills and experience that you directly possess that you can bring to a role. It's the knowledge, skills, and experience you have access to. I have kind of dual perspectives on this because, our community is oriented towards emerging heads of people and chief people officers. So people making that transition we're talking about. But I also host the Redefining Work podcast, where I'm mostly interviewing senior chief people officers, CHROs, Fortune 100 CEOs. And even at that level, when you talk about how to navigate the hard things, all of them speak to being able to lean on their peer networks to be able to help them. Because again, like nobody has seen and done everything. And so you've got to be really intentional about building those networks on your way up, not just when you arrive at that C-suite. And I think in doing so, you'll be able to, harness that collective intellect of your network equity to bring to kind of solve problems, including things you haven't seen before.
Lars, I love that. I just wanted to add that I practice that regularly. I belong to a working group of executive development colleagues in tech companies. And I just had a call on Friday with a peer of mine at Dell, and he walked me through their transformation strategy and what they're doing to get their executives up to speed. And not only was it so inspiring and a little mind-blowing, by the way, but I literally took that back to my organization and thought about what elements from what I just learned there can I apply to what we're doing. It was incredibly valuable. So not only having that external perspective, hearing it almost as a case study, and then saying, what can I do with it? And what does it mean for us? We're in different tech companies and different, we're not competitors or anything, so that's okay. Building on those ideas and seeing how I can leverage them was incredibly valuable for me. And I agree with that so much. Being able to have someone you can talk to, even outside your own world, that you can bounce ideas off of and really help expand your thinking is pretty powerful.
I have a couple of thoughts on this, and I want to play right off of Suzanne. Like, she just modeled for everyone listening what it looks like to engage in the practice of strategic thinking. She went and gathered outside best practices, brought them in and thought about how they were fit for use for her organization, and got to work sharing it and deploying it and putting it in action. my headline thought on the answer to your question of how do we actually build strategic thinking. So we know that adults, once they hit that VP level and above, it is experiential learning all the rest of the way. To Lars's point, most of our learning is going to come from our interaction with our peers or external stakeholders and external peers. As we think, we're talking today about competencies. So for everyone listening, if you hear us use a word, write it down. You probably need to go and learn what skills comprise that competency. Mm-hmm. And when we work with executives in their private coaching, we get real about what are the competencies that you need to grow between that role and your next. What experiences do you need to have inside of your organization to grow those, which need to come from outside of your organization? And then we help them build their business case for getting those opportunities as part of their executive coaching. This is also a hallmark of being in the C-suite. It's an intentional growth of your skill set and career. And that requires you to sit back and think about what it is you need to develop and then create the opportunity to go try it.
Actually, I want to throw something out to Tegan and Suzanne because, you both are the experts on leadership development. I would not, claim to be that. But I am curious. One of the things that I think is a kind of duality, if you will, when you're moving from VP to C-suite is that, obviously to move into that area, you have to display a level of domain mastery, competency, skills, presence, right? Like all these things that we kind of consider to be like C-suite traits. But at the same time, especially in these environments where you haven't seen and done all these things before, there has to be a level of kind of growth mindset and a level of humility as to what you don't know. How do you, when you're coaching leaders, like how do you recommend they balance that? Because I think that there is we've talked about imposter syndrome, a lot. And I think that that is a real thing for people making that transition. They're afraid to ask those questions because they don't want to, kind of out themselves as maybe seeming like they don't know. What advice do you have for leaders to kind of, walk that line of kind of competency and like outwardly showing that you're capable of this while also being, humble enough to say that you don't know and that you do have questions about strategy, whatever it might be?
I mean, really, one of the hallmarks of being a great leader is the ability to be trustworthy and have trust, right? And vulnerability builds trust. So to be vulnerable with saying, I don't know, or can you help me, or I need your help, is a really important leadership trait. And in doing so, it builds trust and respect and creates stronger relationships. So I will often coach leaders on how to ask for that help and be vulnerable because it is one of the shortcuts to trust, which is super important at that level.
I think that we have kept it a secret how much CEOs don't know and are willing to admit when they're healthy that they don't know everything. And it's not their job to know everything. It is our job as leaders to know enough to be effective and superior in our particular role and to be able to get the best from others in partnership. So no CEO is running the organization without consulting with finance, without consulting with operations and allowing them to do their best work and consult back up with him or her as they make decisions. And I think when we're in earlier parts of our leadership, we don't understand that. We have this story we tell ourselves about the C-suite and they're all knowing this, and it's a fallacy. And so then we operate from that fallacy while we're a VP or perhaps more junior than that. And I think our opportunity is to learn to balance those two, as Suzanne said. Executive presence. It's one of those things that often gets tangled up with confidence. People think it's just about looking the part, but there is so much more to it. Suzanne had some interesting thoughts on this, especially in today's environment. So I had to ask, what does executive presence truly mean now?
I wanted to share a research study which was done on people who had advanced in their careers and got promoted. So this research study was, what were the 4 things that people who were able to get promoted did? So 4 things. One is exuding an aura of credibility. And credibility is really a big part of leadership and executive presence. Another was making accomplishments visible, which is often very difficult for people to do. Third, something Lars mentioned already, building a network of key, powerful players and stakeholders. And then fourth was being able to influence without authority. So if you can do those 4 things well, chances are you'll be able to get promoted and advance your career. What's interesting is you could take a look and even do a mini self-assessment. So which of those maybe if I were to focus on would help me become even stronger, or where is an area that needs some attention and some development? So just wanted to put that out there. And this was based on research by a woman named Jo Miller. When it comes to executive presence, it's a tricky one, right? There's a lot of kind of even negativity around, or even bias around what it means to be a charismatic leader today. I came across a definition that I've used in executive coaching stakeholder interviews that I love, and it comes from a book by Halpern and Lupar. And they define leadership presence as the ability to connect authentically with the thoughts and feelings of others in order to motivate and inspire toward a desired outcome. So it's a very cool definition of executive presence. What didn't you hear? Dressing a certain way. What you didn't hear is, showing up and being charismatic a certain way, or an extrovert, right? So this is about connecting authentically. Hello, vulnerability. We just talked about that. About motivating and inspiring others who may or may not report to you, who may be customers, who may be board members, inspiring and motivating them toward a desired outcome. So I love that definition of leadership presence.
I think what is so tricky about this, and I have a story here I can share as well, is that executive presence can really be a catch-all for unconscious bias. It is so dangerous if we are not working from a shared definition, like that succinct one Suzanne shared, then we are all over the place. It's a huge bucket of stuff. I have someone who we're coaching right now who is in line as to take over from the CEO, and the board's feedback is that he needs to work on his executive presence. And when he asked for specifics, they had none. So best of luck, friend. Like there's not much to do there, right? And then some of the, the forerunners of thinking on this topic, like Sylvia Ann Hewlett, who wrote a book about this in 2014, has recently released an article that talks about the changes over the last 10 years and what we value in executive presence, which is so fascinating. So she's still working from a model that's gravitas, communication traits, and appearance as the 3 core areas. And those are comprised of many other things. But what we are seeing replace is that inclusiveness is all of a sudden part of executive presence, where that was not on the radar 10 years ago. Having vision over coming from like a blue chip company is more highly valued. Your appearance, authenticity has replaced physical attractiveness. So this is just a flavor. She's mapped all of this out. So certainly worth looking at. I appreciate some of those changes, and I think they're equally ambiguous as some of the previous ones, right? So I think anytime an exec gets feedback that this is an area of focus for them, it is really beneficial to hold that stakeholder giving the feedback accountable to a very specific definition of what that looks like in action, not just to that stakeholder, but perhaps also to the board of directors, if that's one of the stakeholder groups.
I want to key on kind of one point around it, which I think is important, but does require a bit more context, which is vulnerability. I think I've seen, and I've had a lot of conversations with executives who, kind of shared some of their own stories about being vulnerable with employees and talked about the trust that earned them. And so a couple of examples that come to mind was somebody who worked at a mining company in Australia who came out to their employees as a leader for the first time. And it was not the most accepting environment, yet they did. And people ended up rallying around that individual. There's another woman who was rolling out, an executive, they were rolling out a fertility benefit to the organization. And she chose to share her own experience with infertility and kind of what that meant to her in the journey, and obviously connected with a lot of people who are experiencing similar things. There was another CEO who they're rolling out a mental health benefit plan, and unprompted, kind of on the spot, they started talking about some of their own struggles with mental health, including suicidal ideation, right? And these are very heavy, hard topics that are not the kind of things that you typically expect executives to share. And obviously, in these scenarios, they were very comfortable doing so. This was kind of how they wanted to show up, and it allowed them to connect with their employees in a much deeper way. I think, my slight kind of pause on vulnerable. And again, for me personally, that is also how I show up as a leader. And that's, part of, I think, what makes me who I am. But I also understand that not everybody operates that way. And there's sometimes, as I've coached some leaders who've made that transition, who maybe are more introverted, maybe more private, maybe just, don't want to share their personal lives as much. We kind of put vulnerability on this pedestal, so to speak, as like a really valuable trait of great leaders. And for them, that's not comfortable. They're not comfortable doing that. And so, they can either try to do that and show up in an inauthentic way, or honor the fact that that's just not their style and be true to themselves and be authentic and not try to put themselves out there if that is not how they want to show up. And so it's just interesting. I think, for me, I do think vulnerability is a secret sauce to great leadership, but I think we have to kind of, caution ourselves of trying to push people to be vulnerable that are not comfortable doing so, and perhaps putting them in a place where they're being inauthentic, which I think is more damaging than actually being vulnerable.
Showing up authentically is such a key part of executive presence. You can't fake that. And when you try to be someone you're not, it shows. It's not about pretending to fit some outdated mold of what an executive quote unquote should be. Sure, there's room to refine things, but at the core, people can always tell when you're being real versus trying to fit into a role. The key is that you only ever do what feels right and authentic to you.
I was having a conversation with a senior partner at a Big Four professional services firm last week, and he'd been there for 25 years. And he was bumping up against the way the firm wanted him to show up and his own values. So we literally had this conversation about, okay, you understand what this organization, what this company is valuing. And by the way, it's shifted, right? Because of some of the circumstances that the Big Four firms are finding themselves in, right? So this is a leader who is very driven, very results oriented, brilliant, operates at a very breakneck speed. So if people can't keep up with him, he is frustrated and impatient. And he's been given feedback that he needs to change. So we had this conversation around, how do you balance out understanding what the company values and who you are, and still being true to who you are while responding to what the company needs from you? And at some point, you have a decision to make. Do you want to stay there and shift your behaviors, or go find another organization that might be more aligned with your values and might be more responsive, whether it was a different size, whether it was a startup, whether it was a different industry? And that's sort of the work, right, that he has to do. And that's what coaching can bring, is sort of awareness to these conversations. So agree, you don't want to be vulnerable for the sake of vulnerability. You don't want to be, also say that vulnerability is just revealing your personal thoughts, right? There's so much more to it. It is, though, about finding that balance of being authentic to who you are as a leader, while at the same time honoring what the culture needs of you as a leader. And if that gap is too big for you and you can't be authentic, then it could be an opportunity to start evaluating other options.
We're speaking in competencies, but then we have all these undercurrents of, like, the point Lars was making is like, can I make myself safe? Like self-confidence, personal safety within myself, which is my job, being comfortable in who I am. Then what is the organization's level of safety? What are the cultural norms that allow me to be or not be who I am to whatever degrees we want to be? And then the shifting landscape. I mean, we have watched executives and leaders be like number one in line for the next thing. And because of major changes in the org, they are no longer the person. Right? So like this stuff is vulnerable in its essence. And then it's asking us to show up and be vulnerable and authentic in the middle of it with shifting sands, right? So this is complicated stuff. For anyone listening, there is not a simple recipe. It requires a lot of constant self-checking and feedback, and the ability to see patterns in your own environment that allow you to be safe and feel safe or unsafe and make those very decisions Suzanne's talking about. We reflected on which one fixable issue stands out to each of us. It feels tough to pick because there's so many things that can hold people back. But when you stop and think about it, some challenges simply come up repeatedly. So we talked about how we might go about fixing those challenges.
I see this, and it's so hard to watch when people are really putting themselves first instead of their team or the organization. So it's very ego-driven, self-serving. Ambition is healthy and it's good in leadership. And if it goes unchecked or too far and people can sense that you're doing it for your own good versus the good of others, your customers, the company, I've seen that be a little bit of a downfall.
All right, I'm picking one. The one I pick is our ability to repair well. I mean, we are going to make mistakes, and many of them involve our relationships. And I think, and not just our relationships, due to all the ambiguity, we're going to make the wrong choice, design the wrong plan. We cannot have enough facts and data anymore. It just doesn't exist the way it used to make decisions. And I think our ability to own that from a place of power and humility, as we've talked about earlier, is a key to being able to rise. And let me tell you, the higher you rise, if you will, I'll use that kind of language, the more sophisticated the relationships are and the more visible your mistakes are going to be. So really developing a style with which you recover well.
For some people, I think it's actually the other direction, self-doubt. Because I think that, we talked about like most people think the CEOs, for example, or C-suite have it all figured out. They don't. Right? They don't. There's lots of things that they don't know. And maybe, some have a level of executive presence that offsets that a little bit. It makes it harder to see, but nobody has it all figured out. Like there's nobody in the C-suite has everything figured out. And I think sometimes that just that mental shift from like the notion of C-suite is put on this like pedestal that people feel is like, oh, I can't be ready for that. I'm not, I don't have the skills necessary for that. I don't have it all figured out. All right. That self-doubt creeps in. And I think overcoming that, because self-doubt can be self-sabotage, if you can. And not to say that you should like, of course I deserve that. Like it's not about saying go the other way and have an ego. But I think some people like view that as like such a leap that they don't go for it. And it might be an internal move where, they could have put their hat in the ring and they probably would have gotten the role if they did, but they just felt that gap was too big or that they just had enough self-doubt that they didn't do it. And maybe they hired somebody even less qualified, in that role. So I think the other side of ego will go self-doubt, kind of holding people back.
It's tough to watch when you see someone who would be perfect for a role, but they're holding themselves back because of the story they're telling themselves about why they can't do it or why they're not ready. That self-doubt can be heartbreaking because they're capable of so much more. And as we wrapped up this conversation, we had a chance to reflect on the big picture and leave executives something to think about as they continue their journeys into the C-suite.
I mean, honestly, I'd say put in the work. And I don't mean that to like, discredit like anything else or that. I'm not trying to make like a punchy statement, but, I think when you look at, there was a quote by Jensen Huang, NVIDIA's, CEO, where he kind of talked about suffering and resilience and how, there's no job that's beneath him. And that's not the kind of stuff you usually hear CEOs say. But to me, not that I wish suffering or the necessity for resilience on anyone, but I think when you're willing to kind of roll up your sleeves, you're willing to pitch in wherever you can. You have that real hunger about how you grow. That may be in your domain. It may be outside of your domain, particularly if you're looking to move into the C-suite. One recommendation that I would say, just to kind of give you something more specific, is move to other areas of the business. When you look at, and again, my domain tends to be, HR and people for the most part. But when you look at some of the most successful CHROs and chief people officers today, they've all done tours of duty, not all, but many of them have done tours of duty inside the business outside of HR. And it brings you like an empathy for the customer. It builds your business domain in other areas. So that's what I'd certainly suggest. If you want to get to that point, be willing to put in the work and also be willing to move into other areas of the business outside of that domain you think that you want right now.
Follow your energy and really understand your strengths and what energizes you, because you're going to perform a lot better if you're doing things that allow you to experience positive emotions. Your brain performs better at positive than at stress, negative, or neutral. So follow your energy, have a beginner's mindset, continuously learn from everyone and everything, and then figure out where you want to make an impact and make that impact. So I do think once you do get up there, VP to C-suite, it's important to have an international or global assignment, enterprise-wide experience, either P&L or sales, and just be willing to learn.
I would tell anyone this, and we've been extremely intellectual today. I would move us into the realm of our physical selves. I watch senior leaders waking up these days to getting rid of alcohol, making sure they're sleeping, having some kind of physical challenge or exertion, because we now understand that the science of our intellect is rooted in our health, our physical health. And I think to perform like a true corporate athlete and executive, you have to tend to that part of your life and rest and eat well and really be balanced. And that's hard when you work hard. But I think it is kind of an unlock for next level performance. And we often don't talk about it. So I wanted to make sure we threw that in, that we're really thinking about how our physicality impacts what we think about, how we think, our clarity, our ability to be strategic. Moving to the C-suite is not just about sharpening your skills. It's about expanding your mindset, thinking beyond your department, and building those key relationships that will help you thrive at the top. Lars, Suzanne, and I talked a lot about the importance of staying curious, being true to yourself as a leader, and the power of having a strong network around you. The move is one that you can prepare for by continuously learning, adapting, and leading with both confidence and humility. These ideas aren't just for the workplace. They can also help you in your personal life by strengthening your relationships and guiding your decisions with more clarity. As you go forward, think about how you can apply what we discussed today. Maybe it's taking some time to grow your network, seeking out new opportunities to learn, or just being open to feedback and growth. Every small step gets you closer to where you want to be. Thanks for joining us on this episode of the Life and Leadership Podcast. If you enjoyed our conversation, don't forget to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube Music, and share it with anyone who might benefit from it. We'll catch you in the next episode.